So welcome everyone. I'm Yazid Sayer. I'm a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And the goal of this panel is to explore how states across the Mediterranean, the southern Mediterranean countries, the northern Mediterranean, i.e. southern Europe countries, eastern Mediterranean, Turkey, how they interact, what the evolving dynamics of competition and cooperation are, and in particular in light of political economic consequences of new energy deals, securitization of migration, and emerging institutional or bilateral arrangements across the Mediterranean. What does all this mean for regional integration, for fragmentation, and power balancing in the wider Mediterranean space? Now, there's a tendency to focus on relations in particular between the southern Mediterranean and the northern Mediterranean, with Brussels in particular and individual European governments. But increasingly, we must look at a wider network of relationships and interactions that go both north and north-south, east-west, and that extend beyond the immediate Mediterranean basin towards the Gulf and beyond, and also south into Africa. Now, I'm joined today by Ishaq Diwan, who's Research Director at the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics, Yasmin Zaghloul, a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Center, Hamza Meddeb, Research Fellow at the Carnegie Center as well, Sinan Ülgen from Carnegie Europe, and Nabil Fahed, who's the Vice Chairman of the Chambers of Commerce of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. And I'm going to put a number of questions to them, but before we do that, we've got a brief video that we'll watch now. That's my cue. So I'm going to start immediately with Ishaq, with a basic but maybe vast question. The Mediterranean used to be the center of global trade in antiquity. How do you situate it economically these days? So very simple, but like everything.
I mean, I'm an economist, so I'll think about it economically, right? This was the Mediterranean, the sea in between, the sea that unites. This is where commerce started from the Hotel Phoenicia, the Phoenicians spread around the Mediterranean. But now it's a much more fragmented zone economically. We can think of a fracture east-west, as you said. The East, the remnant of the Ottoman Empire, trying to catch up with the West, Europe, and this interaction continued. And most recently, we had the EU-Med agreement and attempt to integrate East and West, which we can talk about, basically failed. And it's an initiative that went nowhere. What we have in the East Mediterranean are now economies that are a bit like Lebanon or Egypt or Tunisia in bad shape, over-indebted, with very low economic growth, and with kind of two poles that we can also talk about of growth that could revive them. One being the old Constantinople, Turkey, an industrial powerhouse, and the other, the GCC, which is rising as a financial powerhouse. So that's about the East-West. The other split that you talk about geographically is the North-South. The Mediterranean is now a cemetery for refugees and economic migrants coming from Africa. It's a wall separating Europe, the welfare nation of Europe, and Africa, which is growing demographically, the most rapidly growing demographically continent in the world, with Europe very aging and a continent that has less and less young vitality, and so we need to think of that interaction. But right now, Europe is focusing its aid to North Africa on being a good police state, and it has not invested there, has focused instead on investing in Eastern Europe. But North Africa itself is focusing on diversifying and investing in Africa. So all these are interesting themes to develop. I will add one more. You know, the 20th century was the century of the Atlantic, and as commerce moved to the Atlantic, the Mediterranean and the Middle East in particular moved to the periphery. But the new century, the 21st century, is the century of the Pacific, and again, the Mediterranean is the region between. Now it's between East and West. It's back to being the Middle East, extremely geopolitically important link. And we were talking a bit about this morning in terms of the role that the Gulf could be playing between East and West, but that's broader. The whole Mediterranean is in this passage route right now.
Thanks, Ha. So you've set the stage. I'm going to take this straight to Hamza to follow up. How do you see trade and investment flows in particular between Southern Europe and Northern Africa, but maybe also East-West, as Ha was just saying, or further south than the Mediterranean? How do you see these flows intersecting with political alignments and regional cooperation in particular?
Yeah. Well, I mean, trade and investment, I mean, used to be really important in the Mediterranean, actually, and they are still important, actually. Let me give a bit of context, because to understand the context and the historical context in which, I mean, investment and trade played in this region. I mean, this year marks the 30 years anniversary of the Euro-Mediterranean relations with the Barcelona process that started in '95. At that time, trade and investments were perceived and were presented as really, I mean, engines for integration between the two shores of the Mediterranean, actually. I mean, remember the whole political framework that was created and built at that time over the 90s and the years 2000, and we saw at that time the European Union, the European countries actually leveraging the investment and trade with, of course, I mean, to promote the democracy, human rights, etc., and to build in a way a space in which, a Mediterranean space in which countries in both the north and southern shores will converge in a way. 30 years later, it's time for an assessment, and the result that many countries in the north, but also in the south, ended up realizing actually is that this convergence doesn't exist, actually. What happened is we saw a deindustrialization of countries, I mean, like Tunisia and other countries in the region, but we saw also deindustrialization in France and Spain, basically. This is one thing. The second thing is that investment was perceived or was depicted to be really an engine. The problem is that Europe didn't or hasn't been investing in the southern neighborhood. Only 3% of European investments go to the South Mediterranean. If you compare this with China or with the US, who invest 25% of the total investments in their neighborhood, you understand that these countries, they allow in a way an anchoring or a connecting actually the economies in their neighborhood to these countries, and they allow a sort of development. The problem here is that really, I mean, investment, I mean, you cannot, or the Europeans, they are realizing increasingly that it's impossible to stabilize the southern neighborhood without investing in it. Most of the investments went to the Eastern European countries, actually. Now, I think after 30 years, what we have seen is increasingly a sort of politicization of trade and investments. What Minister Bissat mentioned today, this morning, about the use of trade and investments increasingly like political leverages. We are seeing this in the Mediterranean today. We saw Algeria boycotting the import of agricultural products and wheat from France, and Morocco, I mean, jumping in and increasing its imports from France to prevent like a crisis for the French farmers, for example. We saw Tunisia contracting a Chinese company to build a bridge using European funds. And this is really was a source of tension between the European Union and Tunisia. But at the end, the European capitals didn't want actually to contest openly this, of course, for migration reasons, etc. So what we are seeing today is clearly, I mean, a growing politicization of trade and investments in this region. Now, I think two major factors helped or explain or helped this politicization or explain this politicization. The first one is that clearly, I mean, the end of this big project or big ideal that was built or created in the 90s, in the mid-90s, and the erosion of this, the normative power of Europe, actually, that through trade, through investment, through free trade agreements, actually, there will be development for countries in the southern neighborhood. This was not the case. And I think this brought many countries to understand that they have to look for alternatives. And the second thing is the growing activism of non-Mediterranean countries in the Mediterranean. I would say that China today is the major trade partner for many countries in the Mediterranean. This is one thing. The second thing is that an important part of trade today is between North African countries, and this is the case of Morocco with sub-Saharan Africa, actually. So there is a diversification or an attempt to diversify. I think Morocco offers an interesting case where using free trade with Europe, but also with the US, with Latin America, etc., to position itself as a platform connecting different areas and trade blocks. And we are seeing now even Chinese companies settling in Morocco to be able to export elsewhere. So I think, I mean, it doesn't mean that these relations, this trade and the investment relations don't play a role. Of course, I mean, that's not the case. I mean, there's still investment in that region, but increasingly what we are seeing is a politicization. That's one thing. And the second thing, diversification of the trade flows, actually, with the arrival of China over maybe the last 10 to 15 years, actually. Yeah.
Thanks. So I have a parallel question for Nabil, but I'll frame it a little bit. So to my mind, what Hamza just described, the failure of convergence 30 years ago, reminds me of the period in the 1970s when the boom in oil prices triggered massive flows of capital between Arab states along with labor. And there was some hope at that time that this would lead to a level of financial integration, of financial institutional integration across at least Arab countries. That didn't happen, to my mind. Now, so what I want to come to you with is to look more narrowly, specifically at financial capital and the role of the private sector, and to ask you to what extent can business-driven cooperation across and around the Mediterranean, whether east-west or north-south, whether this is in the form of cross-border trade initiatives, sectoral arrangements, etc., how can this sort of business-driven cooperation help anchor more durable forms of regional integration? And again, I keep in mind what I see as a failed opportunity in the 1970s. Do you see that business-driven opportunities or initiatives and relationships can create something that is more enduring?
Well, when we look at the situation now around the Mediterranean in the area, we see that all the trade agreements that we have been part of had focused initially on what we call the four freedoms. That is the freedom of goods, of labor, of capital, and of services. And over the past, let's say, 20 or 30 years, we have seen that these freedoms have not actually taken place, except for the freedom of movement of goods. And from the point of view of the countries like Lebanon and the, let's say, eastern or the southern countries, the other freedoms were much more important. So the freedom of moving capital, the freedom of labor, and the freedom of services, and especially services, was a much more important aspect of these trade agreements. So when we look at the, if you say, balance of power or a negotiation, we were actually the very weak party in these trade agreements. And when we look at, let's say, other aspects of these agreements, like the regulatory alignment, okay, it's actually not an alignment, but an imposition of regulatory rules from the European countries on the or the northern countries on the southern countries. So in this respect, we see that, as Minister Psad said in the morning, it's weaponization of trade, weaponization of capital. And in Lebanon, we have actually seen that, very, very closely. We have experienced that. I mean, from the ban of the export to Saudi Arabia, the capital controls that are done, related to Hezbollah and Qard al-Hassan. I'm not saying that it's not whether it's right or not. I'm just saying that these are being used as weapons in order to control what these countries want from Lebanon. So again, we see that these are more tools rather than actual objectives that the northern countries have used. And when we talk about economic integration, it actually makes me laugh a little bit. I mean, what kind of integration are we seeing? It's just rules that are being imposed. And whenever it suits, if we talk about the Euromed agreement in Lebanon, whenever it suits them, they would just, ignore it. We have now a ban on animal product exports from Lebanon to the European Union, even though a lot of companies abide by the regulation and standards of the European regulations. So it's more political and a blanket ban, rather than, specific targeted companies.
So just to make sure I'm taking the point fully, so you feel that business can't really drive the process? I mean, some sort of bottom-up or organic process in which regional integration.
Well, we haven't been able to drive that.
And you don't see any prospects. That's what I'm hearing.
It's quite difficult to move ahead when you have such very high obstacles, and the obstacles cannot be moved neither by lobbying at the local level or lobbying with other countries. I mean, last week there was a Union for the Mediterranean forum where it groups a lot of Mediterranean countries that also again look at green investments, about digitization, about regulatory alignment. And it's just, again, imposing, the view of, the rich and the powerful over the weak and the
powerless.
Just like us.
Thanks. Well, let's go to the opposite end of the Mediterranean, the western end. I'll come to you, Yasmin. So how are North African states using energy investments and partnerships with Europe to enhance their own regional influence and resilience?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen like a major uptick in like energy investments throughout North Africa, and usually that either goes towards renewables, so in the case of Morocco and Tunisia, or towards major investments in the hydrocarbon industry for Algeria. I think a lot of these are obviously mostly Europe-facing. The EU plays a major role, but just between brackets, other countries like the GCC, for example, also play quite a big role in shaping energy investments throughout the region, and especially here again for Morocco and Tunisia. I think in terms of like shaping their influence, placing the Maghreb, well, I speak mostly of the Maghreb when I say North Africa, but placing the Maghreb kind of in the middle of these energy investments, I think, forces us to see its role as platforms, and that's what Hamza mentioned earlier. I think it's really, again, putting it in this kind of like strategic positions where we're no longer just speaking of the Maghreb-EU relations in terms of migration or in terms of like trade and goods, but it's also tied to the survival to some extent and stability of Europe itself in today's context. I think a lot of kind of these dynamics and the ways in which energy investments have shaped the Maghreb states' ability to bargain with different actors is also to some extent shaping its own influence in Africa. And I'm here again specifically around Morocco, and Hamza mentioned some of this earlier. But we kind of see the ways in which Morocco has been able to build some capacity with energy investments in its own territory through relationships with Europe, and how this is in turn also being kind of projected outward onto the rest of the African continent. When it comes to resilience, I view these energy investments mostly in renewables to be coming from like two different perspectives on each side of the Mediterranean. I think obviously Europe is coming at it from a perspective of diversifying, and that's been mentioned earlier as well in the kind of post-Ukraine context. Whereas Maghreb countries, to some extent, especially here again, Morocco, to some extent Tunisia, are seeing this in a longer kind of trajectory over energy sovereignty. And that's kind of sometimes how, in the Morocco case, you have these discussions around why investing in these projects is important. And I think these two are political projects that are not just economic or not just geopolitical, but they also are relying on, they have very different metrics of success, very different kind of timetables. One is slightly more tied to, is more immediate, is more in the kind of survivalist frame, and the other is perhaps more stretched long-term with more political questions around, you know, is this a win-win situation? Who's bearing the costs for these investments? Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I find Morocco in particular almost fascinating, I guess, that it's almost the only country in the southern Mediterranean which is both developing things like its automobile industry, aviation, in ways that integrate it with Europe, but also energy, and as you said, where it actually looks south into the African continent in a far more systematic way, I think, than pretty much any other Arab country, maybe except the Emirates right now. The one exception, and I'm not sure where to place Turkey, whether, I mean, it's not a southern Mediterranean country. Geographically, it's northern, but I don't think of it as a southern European country. And it's this very interesting case where it too has, you know, an active ambition. You used the term earlier today, Sinan. An ambition, not just in the near Middle East, but also in Africa. It extends in various forms. So to tie this back to the Mediterranean, it's, how do you see Turkey leveraging its geopolitical and economic influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also further across the Mediterranean basin on either side? And how does that link up with its extension of influence and involvement even further south into the African continent? So I'm sort of setting up maybe a false parallel here between Morocco and Turkey at the other end of the Mediterranean, both of which employ much more of a north-south dynamic in both directions than, to my mind, any other Arab country does almost, or certainly not in North Africa.
Yes, thanks, Yazid. Let me answer the question on Turkey, or Turkey as we call it lately. But I also want to react to something that I heard, you know, on the panel regarding, you know, the trade and investment relationship with China and how that's going to affect the future of the region. But a few words about Turkey first. Indeed, the Mediterranean is a space, and it's basically an extended space for how Turkey wants to develop its relationships in accordance with its own understanding of strategic autonomy. And for the policymakers in Ankara, this is the area where the implementation of strategic autonomy makes sense. geographically, historically, culturally, economically. So many of the actions that you can sort of define under these initiatives of strategic autonomy happen in the space. It happens in the Levant, it happens in Northern Africa, and even beyond that, there is now quite a well-developed outlook on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that's being, widely commented really as a possibly a latecomer, but nonetheless quite an effective actor. So yes, we're not China, we don't have those capabilities, we're not France, for good or for bad, we don't have the colonial heritage there, and there's a different model that Turkey exposes to Africa. It's not something that is, as conditional as the relationship that some of the, European countries have had on the continent. But at the same time, it's not China either. It's somewhere in between. The difference with China primarily is in the fact that the Turkish economic presence in Africa is led by non-state actors. Because ultimately Turkey is not a country that that has the Chinese model of state capitalism. So whoever goes to Africa may be incentivized by the state. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but ultimately they're private decisions. Now there are some exceptions to that. There's been a lot of commentary about the success of Turkish Airlines, for instance. Previously one of the examples that was remarkable, it does link the African continent in a way that France used to do. So previously, I lived in Senegal for a year. So previously, to go from Dakar to Kenya, you used to fly from Paris. It didn't really make sense, right? You're gonna go directly east, and you just take a trip north, and then a trip south to go east. Now, all of that scheme has been, in a way, reversed. Istanbul has become the hub connecting Africa, within Africa and the African continent to the rest of the world. So in that sense, it's a success story. But there's also a political dimension to this, in the sense that where, the way that, this element of soft power that is coupled with connectivity, that's coupled with investments, is also obviously being used to leverage Turkey's political influence in this geography. And sometimes that matters. We saw this in for instance, in the elections for the UN Security Council in the past, where I think 44 members of the African continent voted for Turkey's membership out of the 52, if I'm correct. So there's been, quite a bit of effort in that direction. Now today, for another example, is Turkey's diplomatic network. In the African continent, we have 46 embassies in Africa in total. And some of them are still in the pipeline. There's a project to open an embassy in Lesotho, for instance. We're probably going to be the second country to do that in the world after South Africa, but nonetheless. So this is definitely a space where Turkey has, a lot of interest. It does, come in parallel with these ambitions of exerting its strategic autonomy, sometimes at odds with its partners in the West, sometimes at odds with China, sometimes at odds with Russia. So there is no, core alliance when Turkey practices this strategic autonomy. I just want to say a few words also about China and what I heard from the panel, especially from you, Hamza. Because I think the future of the trade and investment relationship between the southern Mediterranean and the northern Mediterranean is going to be shocked. And the name of that shock is going to be China. Now, that shock is not an internal shock, it's an exogenous shock. It's coming from the fact that China has appended, because of its economic model, has essentially appended the global rules on trade and investment. There is an article that I would, for those that are interested, that I would highly recommend our 15-second propaganda again for Carnegie, Michael Pettis, who's also a China expert, about 2 weeks ago, he wrote, a very, I think, insightful article. That's an argument that has been saying, but he put that in very Cartesian format in that one. And the argument there is that either China is going to change in terms of how it conducts its economic model, generating these huge surpluses. Just last month, China became the first country that has recorded $1 trillion of trade surplus. Now, he says the world can't sustain this. And his only recipe for Europe, and this is where it links to the Mediterranean, is that the EU has no other option but to turn protectionist. The US has done that. The EU has to do that. And the EU turning protectionism will append the relationship between the southern Mediterranean and the northern Mediterranean, because ultimately and simplistically, that relationship was predicated on the assumption that the southern Mediterranean will get FDI from the northern Mediterranean. That will create jobs. That will create, additional production, which would then be supplied to the northern European markets. That paradigm is going to end if the EU turns really protectionist. So that would be my, sort of alarm bell as we're discussing the Mediterranean, because we like to believe in the Mediterranean being, a whole, and it's not a H-W-H-O, in its entirety, that there won't be any disconnects, but that disconnect is coming, and that's a very serious disconnect, not driven by the dynamics from within the region, but from outside the region.
Sinan, thanks. And because that was so much substance there, I'm changing the order of my questions and coming to you with another question, which is, what role do you think Turkey might play in future in shaping regional cooperation or conflict dynamics over the next few years? Because maybe it's time to bring back hard power as well. That also is one of the relationships and dynamics across the Mediterranean. And one of the amazing things is to hear about the degree to which Turkey and Egypt are in alignment right now on Sudan, to the extent where there's a possibility of either joint or parallel military action. I don't think maybe Egypt will go that far, but this was unthinkable just a year, let alone 3 years ago. Turkey, of course, is involved in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere with military training missions and so on. So Turkey is clearly positioned, as you made a very interesting point about the economic extension in Africa being much more a private sector affair. But when it comes to hard power, that's very much about the state and about political perception and ambition. So coming back to the Mediterranean basin in particular, how do you see the sort of future prospects of the Turkish role in either promoting cooperation, diplomatic sort of consultation, versus just sort of saying there's a realpolitik game, we're going to make sure we're ahead in it?
Well, you have to understand that Turkish foreign policy has evolved quite considerably from a decade ago, where, after the Arab Spring, the understanding or the illusion was that Turkey could extend this influence in this geography by aligning itself with entities linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Because, the expectation was that these movements would essentially, if democracy would have prevailed in some of these countries, would come to power on the basis of their popularity, and Turkey being linked, or I wouldn't say Turkey, AK Party, the ruling party, having an attachment, would then essentially be able to grow Turkey's footprint and regional influence in many of those countries. That policy proved to be a huge strategic mistake. It ended up in tears. Turkey became isolated. It tarnished its relations with many of the countries in the region and beyond. And since 2020, there has been a very serious recalibration. So today, when Turkey looks at the region, it's with a different angle. It has taken the right lessons from that period of aggressive interventionist policy, where Turkey was seen to be siding with some of the internal political actors in a range of these countries. So now the policy has moved away from that. And we have seen vast improvements in bilateral ties. You gave the example of Egypt. That's definitely true. The relationship with Egypt was perhaps the last one to be redressed, including relations with the GCC. So there has been a vast improvement. Now, on the back of that vast improvement, however, Turkey's ambition to become a more influential regional actor, occasionally supported by its willingness to use hard power, remains. We see this very clearly in Libya, for instance. The whole outcome of the conflict got changed with Turkey's involvement, with Turkey supporting the government in Tripoli against Haftar. But today, again, there's a rebalancing, and Turkey is able to talk to both actors in Libya. So it's become, quite influential, within that scope. And on the basis, and after that, there's been a very strategic development of the country's willingness and capacity to do mediation. One example was between Ethiopia and Somalia. They came to the brink of an agreement. Unfortunately, it faltered at the last moment, but nonetheless, there was, a real willingness to get involved in geographies where Turkey doesn't even have a strong presence, to tell you the truth. Yes, Somalia very much so, but between Ethiopia, perhaps less the case. So when I look at the future of how Turkey is going to navigate this, two things. One, this is a country that is willing to be ambitious in terms of what it wants to do abroad. That can mean hard power, that can mean, economic assistance, that can mean state building, that can mean participation in, post-conflict missions. That's likely to be the case for Ukraine, for instance, going forward. So that's one thing. The second thing is that Turkey wants to nurture a model, rightly or wrongly, but nonetheless, that is very sui generis in this region. And that's why I wanted to, underline some of these factors related to China, because as Turkey tries to build up the relations in this region, it acts not necessarily as a European country, not necessarily as a new China, but it's trying to build up its own identity. And there are some lessons learned in that respect. And that's why some of these different vehicles of engagement that I try to reference is going to be part of the Turkish identity in this region in the years to come.
So I like the sort of dynamic interplay in many of these issues of disruptive and transformative, in a more positive sense, dynamics and trends and emerging economic, technological, and other factors. So I'm going to come back to you now, Sha, and follow that theme a little bit. So one great example of this is that the Gulf is emerging as a major source. I mean, it has been a major source of funding for Arab countries and much of the Middle East and parts of Africa since the 1970s at least. But now, again, they're emerging as major investors and potentially as new leaders in areas like artificial intelligence. I mean, if all the Emirati and Saudi ambitions that are being turned into deals with the United States and elsewhere come to fruition, how might this trend, I don't mean the AI aspect so much as the rise of the Gulf, but in new ways and in new forms and with new ambition, how might this trend disrupt or transform established patterns of relations among northern and southern Mediterranean countries?
If you allow me, I'd like to take a detour to come exactly to that issue. Because, you know, talking of disarray, we talked of non-state actors, we talked of civil wars, we talked of major effort at reconstruction. You know, when we describe the region, one thing the Jordan, the Tunisia of this world, the average growth for all the middle-income countries of the region around the Mediterranean since the Arab Spring of 2011 is 0%. This is the worst outcome since independence. The previous very bad decade was the decade of the 80s, where all these countries had to change from state-led import substitution growth to a different liberalized growth period. So change to completely different, let's say, political settlement, where regimes became more liberal, and this led to this kind of imbalanced form of capitalism where actually autocrats tried to stay in charge in spite of liberalizing. Now, the big shock that happened that we're still living with is the Arab Spring, because all these autocrats got under tremendous pressure, and they basically, like in Egypt, it's really the paragon, if you like, of what happened around the region, took advantage of very low interest rates globally to borrow their way out of a depression. And so the autocratic restoration was done with massive state deficits, expensive fiscal policies, subsidies, big investment, building new cities and the like that are not productive, because part of the political deal was for these fragile autocrats to not let the private sector take off. There is total mistrust of the private sector. In Egypt, for example, right now, President Sisi have seen two monetary crises, two foreign exchange crises in 2016 and in 2023, each time 50% devaluation. Private investment is at 6-7% of GDP, like in the worst time of Nasser socialist era. As your work has shown, the private sector is literally inexistent. The army rules, owns the country. Lebanon has been in crisis. Tunisia's economy has nearly no economic growth. Basically, again, we have a fragile autocracy that spends a lot on subsidies and on social security and safety nets, but doesn't let any finance go to the private sector, which is decaying. And so it's in a trap. We literally have fragile autocratic traps everywhere. And so we're at the end of a phase. You described Lebanon as trying to get out of this trap. Other countries are not yet trying to come out of this trap. And so there's a great uncertainty about what can happen. Whether there would be social movements or other ways in which this situation can be resolved. Now, in other regions, there's been more incentives to go with reformist growth policies because you had some elevators around. Japan was an elevator for Asia. Europe was an elevator for Eastern Europe. We have had no real elevators in this region. And even some of the miracles that you've described, is Morocco really pulled out by Europe? Is it a miracle or is it a mirage? The recent social movements show us that the growth has been actually very, very fragile. It's growth from above. A lot of jobs were created for engineers in the car industries, but the rural areas, the recent social movement were due to the fact that hospitals are so poor in the south of the country that I think 6 women died in the same week during giving birth. So it's a kind of a top-down model that hopes for a trickle down, and that is not happening. Where is Turkey right now? I mean, the Turkish miracle happened between 2000 and 2015, but since then we've had an expansionary and sustainable monetary and fiscal policy leading to large fiscal account deficits and very high inflation, and an increasingly chronistic economy that is not growing in terms of productivity anymore. We could really say that the whole region, southern Mediterranean, is in a state of economic crisis. Now, salvation will not come from Europe for the reason you're saying. Europe itself is under attack by Make America Great Again on the one hand, and extreme expansion of exports still in China. So the only hope really is coming from the Gulf, to come to your question. The Gulf now is in a position where they're sitting on trillions of dollars in sovereign wealth funds. It's very hard to move that forward. They see the end of oil. They are really led by young, dynamic policymakers that want to diversify, and they know that the days are counted. We're working on the project with Carnegie, with Marwan, on exactly that challenge. And diversifying one country at a time is not easy. These are small countries, and they need to import. Therefore, they need to export real stuff. They need to produce something else than oil. And what kind of value chains can you create when the world is being dominated by robots and China so of course there are some areas where they're investing, but these are not thick areas. In a world that is deglobalizing and regionalizing, where we're seeing China, Europe, the United States rising, what will happen to the Middle East? Doesn't it make more sense to diversify, Gulf capital with the 600 million people in that large market that we have in the Middle East? That's, I think, is a possibility that's becoming more realistic, not to be part of an ummah or for some kind of ideology, but for purely economic reasons. Where can you fructify these trillions of dollars? Of course, you can promise to put them in Wall Street, but that has its limitation and its weaknesses. And we see increasingly, the PIFs and other sovereign wealth funds being invested in the region. We see the markets of the GCC absorbing an increasing share of imports from the region. Actually, we tend to think that intra-regional trade is very small, but when you remove oil and you look at non-fuel intra-regional trade, it's actually 50% of non-oil regional exports. And so increasing, if we look at Lebanon or Jordan, literally all our exports are to the Gulf. If it's not goods, it's people. And so we are, it seems to me, seeing a regional market forming under our eyes slowly, but potentially faster in the future.
So, I mean, if you consider the Gulf, and I'm going to come to Nabil with this, a huge amount of Gulf contracts, especially in energy, but also in infrastructure, refinery capacity, et cetera, are in East Asia, not with Europe or the USA. And so I wonder, I mean, so in other words, there's the possibility of economic growth or revival in some cases happening no longer along traditional familiar lines of relationships with Europe or the US. And Nabil, when in your pretty pessimistic assessment, you emphasized in particular the sort of negative prospects in relation to relations with Europe or the West and their regulations and their requirements and the sort of trap. But does what's happening between the Gulf and East Asia, or how the Gulf is operating now in our own region here, in new ways, in new, more ambitious or assertive ways, do you think that offers something where the private sector of southern and eastern Mediterranean countries might find some new opening which allows them to revive and recapitalize and find new markets that aren't focused on the north? Or do you think that the private sector, even there, doesn't really have, great new opportunities? It's just the big players like the Gulf and China will make certain, will make obtain benefits, but without necessarily transforming the environment within which the private sector of these countries operates.
Well, first let me comment on what is said. He said the private sector in Lebanon is in decay. I'm sorry, we're not in decay at all. We've had, we're going to have 5% real growth this year. Last year, we've had probably 3 to 4%, in areas outside of the war zone. So, it's thriving, it's going in the right direction. And it's all, mind you, all without any bank financing, with the collapse of the banking system. So the private sector is actually expanding, is adopting new technologies. It's, moving along with the ages, with all the changes that are taking place. So we're quite confident that we have, a very strong, if you want, business machine that's working in the country, despite all the challenges and despite all the obstacles that we face. I mean, we are the only country that is exporting franchises mostly to the GCC. Out of all the Arab countries, we are the only one that is creating models and exporting these franchises. So we have something, we have some edge, some competitive edge somewhere there. Now, in relation to, the impact of the trade, let's say, with the East or with China, in 2017, I actually personally signed an agreement for the Belt and Road Initiative with the China Agency for the International Cooperation, but nothing has come out of it, because of the problems that we have faced in the past 6 years. We were expecting a lot of business to come our way from that. We established the China Business Council in Beirut with the purpose of, creating a Chinese hub in the Eastern Mediterranean. Actually, that didn't pan out. So we made all the right moves, towards the East because we saw the potential there. But unfortunately, with all the problems that we've faced in the past 6 years, it's not, coming to fruition. So I would say the purpose to go there is, we have it. We are looking at it. A lot of imports are coming from China, of course, but the establishment of the Tripoli special zone and was actually being, eyed by the Chinese to be a base for them in the Eastern Mediterranean. That also might be, a big step ahead if we manage to do that. So it's a zone which is now still empty. It has a lot of potential, and we hope that if the Chinese or anybody else would come and, anchor their businesses, their investment there. When we look at the cases of Morocco and Turkey, they anchored a lot of businesses in their special economic zone with the aim of exporting to Europe, and it was, we would say, extremely successful in terms of attracting investments, successful in creating exports, in huge numbers towards the European market. And of course, if we can do that in the Bekaa, if we can create special economic zones in the Bekaa, earmarking the Gulf markets, then I think would have a very successful, a twist in our positioning as a country.
Thanks. I mean, I'll be interested to see how that could be scalable and replicable outside of Lebanon, like in Egypt or Jordan, Syria, in, hopefully coming years, Tunisia, I mean, given their own problems. So, I mean, there's clearly a lot of challenges, a lot of structural problems domestically, the banking crisis in Lebanon, the sort of unequal balance of relations between the public and private sector in Egypt, all these different factors, let alone China, MAGA America, European protectionism, and so on. So, Yasmin, let's look at how two particular issues which keep coming up in North-South relations, Northern and Southern Europe, Mediterranean relationships, migration and climate change / energy. So Morocco is a good example, but there are others where this is being spun in positive ways, i.e., well, to generate income from European sources, whether it's in the form of investment or protection money to limit migration or contain it, or to generate new energy schemes, as we know in the Moroccan case. But then these also have their negative consequences, either in terms of climate resilience, dubious impacts, or domestic socioeconomic impacts, as we've again seen in several of these countries, where some of the projects that are sold to generate income and cement relationships with northern partners are also very problematic for local communities and local population, and where the investment and the income from this doesn't necessarily then generate wider economic growth domestically. Problem like we've seen in Tunisia, in southern Tunisia, for instance. So how do you see that sort of relationship? I mean, more good than bad, or is it also going to be something that, faced with these much wider structural challenges, is never going to be quite enough to make a real difference?
I'd probably go with the latter in terms of constraints, that I think is kind of happening at different levels. And I would probably start with the domestic level, to be honest, and kind of considering how these two play out. Because I think in North Africa, and from some of the research that we've been doing on the climate change and governance of mobility in the Middle East and North Africa, usually climate change hits hardest in peripheral regions, in marginalized regions, that have been so through both the colonial period and then post-independence period. And those are like the areas that really tend to feel environmental degradation, climate change, hazards, and so on, really the deepest. And I think we've seen this kind of happen all throughout the region, whether that's in Morocco with Drata Filalt, in the south, with nomadic communities, for example, and water scarcity, whether it is the Kabyl in Algeria with the fires. We've seen recently protests around environmental degradation in Gafsa and Gabas in Tunisia. And so I think when we kind of consider this I think the relationship between climate and migration in North African states tends to be a lot more about state-society relations and about the ways in which oftentimes communities don't necessarily go to the Mediterranean, don't cross the sea first step, but generally try to build some kind of resilience locally first. And that can translate into different ways. So either, again, sedentarism, working in different industries, or kind of all together moving to towns. So small farmers, might work in agribusiness, for example, which is quite a precarious sector that is generally geared toward exports and doesn't really have this kind of long-term social kind of buffer. But with that being said, I feel like there is a lot of, I think, pressure on the states to solve this territorial inequality, this kind of uneven distribution, like you mentioned, Ishaq, earlier. And then I think there is the European side, and that's maybe where the linkages between climate pressures, between migration and security start to become a lot murkier. And I would probably argue that today, in at least the European discourse around climate and migration, is that it's still heavily securitized. It's still very much kind of used in this imaginary of climate pressures are going to push thousands of people across the sea, and they're going to come to Europe, and we must harden border regimes, and we must make them more efficient and faster. And obviously technology also plays a role in this. But it doesn't necessarily solve the issue. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue of labor. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue of livelihoods across the Mediterranean, but also within Europe itself, as we're seeing more and more the whole narrative, around migration being instrumentalized and kind of being quite salient for electoral politics all throughout the West. So we're kind of like, in this really weird sphere where all of these references are like collapsed onto one another. And I would argue that this is why solutions matter, and I would probably link that to the first question on energy investments and the kinds of like adaptations model that we're going with. So without considering, without necessarily considering that, yeah, livelihoods, labor are kind of at the center of this, and without considering the really questions of resilience, but not necessarily, I would argue, not necessarily in the way of, you know, saying local communities must be consulted or projects must have benefit sharing, but really in a more maybe substantial structural way that addresses land usage, for example, that addresses water rights, water policy, that is kind of, yeah, touching at the heart of like, why do centralized policies not necessarily translate in distributive processes that are territorial, but are also social. Yeah, I think these need to be at the heart of it. But today, I would say we're still quite focused on policies that are top-down, especially again in North Africa. And I would go back to the Morocco case, where, you know, a lot of the kind of discourse around how to tackle this is through desalination programs, really kind of really big projects that require a lot of investments, that require a lot of resources, but that somehow also tend to overshadow the importance of climate pressures for domestic stability first and foremost, if that makes sense. And I would just like to close this this point, but also mentioning that a lot of these linkages between migration and climate pressures are kind of felt throughout the region, and that a lot of these flows, Europe really gets the end of these flows, and that a lot of the time, even when migrants are coming from sub-Saharan Africa, they've often come through these very long routes that are themselves impacted by climate, and that are themselves shaped by very harsh climates. And then there's the option of settlements now in countries like Morocco, for example. And so the ones that end up leaving are kind of the end of that equation. I feel like we need to kind of consider that spectrum as a whole, rather than really just focusing on on the idea that climate change is going to lead to migration, which is not really a verified causal relationship for now. I think it's a lot more complex and kind of overlaid.
Thanks, Yasmin. Well, I'm going to wrap up, Hamza, with you and ask, I mean, we've heard a lot, so I'm not going to ask you to go over a lot of it at all, but how do you see these developments, energy, migration, security, on balance, integration, fragmentation?
Yeah. No, I think we have really a nice discussion, and many things, interesting things have been mentioned in the discussion that can give us a sense of where the Mediterranean is heading to. I think Shaq mentioned a very interesting point about this autocratic trap and the costs of restoration, actually. I mean, deficits, debts, devaluation, which means that really, I mean, we have countries that where incumbents are extremely concerned with stability and with survival in a way. I think that's the most interesting feature, maybe in Tunisia and Egypt, in many other countries. Second thing is the shock, and Sinan mentioned, I mean, the China shock, and probably there will be another shock in the few coming years, which is the European carbon barrier mechanism, which will really, actually, it's a sort of green protectionism that will also impact the economies of the South. And I think here, again, we will see also economies suffering, and this will increase the asymmetry between the north and the southern part of the Mediterranean. So to summarize, I think these dynamics in terms of migration will translate into very transactional, very opportunistic ways actually to operate. We have already a sense of how the new approach that has been adopted by Italy and by other European countries is that today, clearly, I mean, the priority is given to migration through agreements, very short-term and very transactional, I mean, agreements. This will encourage what I would call geopolitical, the countries and regimes in the South to seek and to look for geopolitical rents. I mean, clearly, I mean, this is the case in Tunisia, in Egypt, and other countries. I mean, they are not looking no more for transforming their economies. They want really to extract rents and to extract political concessions. They will present themselves as stabilitocracies, you know, like in East European countries. Their main asset and raison d'etre, in a way, it's to provide stability. But at the same time, we know that the stability comes with a cost, which is really the aggravation of the long-term grievances that will end up actually exploding. When it comes to the energy, it's also, again, transactional relations. And here, I think what we are seeing is a fragmentation of the Mediterranean. Italy is playing a major role with, you know, strengthening its relations with Algeria, through Tunisia, with Turkey as well. So there are Morocco with Spain, etc. We are seeing an interconnected Mediterranean. Clearly, I mean, and probably in the East Mediterranean, there will be also a tense competition with Turkey, of course, and other players around the issue of energy, because it will be also extremely strategic in the future. And in terms of security, I would say that, again, I mean, what we will be seeing, and this is already the case, it's the Southern Mediterranean perceived as a buffer zone in a way, because clearly, I mean, from the European perspective, North Africa is a buffer zone, is a sort of shield. It's a shield because, I mean, given the migration, given the instability in the Sahel, what starts in the Sahel ends in a way in Europe. So, and all this coup belt, what we call the coup belt, starting from Sudan all the way to Guinea, is really, I mean, a major source of concern. So the result of this, we are having an interconnected Mediterranean, an asymmetric region, but clearly also a not integrated one, because this promise of shared prosperity that was, I mean, promised in the Barcelona process is not a rendezvous, as we say. It's really a missed one in a way. But at the same time, this will be a region really shaped with transactionalism, a lot of transactionalism, and the sort of opportunistic geopolitics. That's my conclusion.
Thanks. I mean, that was a very effective conclusion. I'm going to rush into ending the session, and we're going to move straight into the fireside chat with His Excellency Minister Hassan Salami and my director, Maha Yahya. So please remain in the room if you want to attend that.